The recording. The projection screen still glowed with my findings when they all stood in unison. 12 executives, their faces contorted with a mixture of anger and contempt, pushed back their chairs simultaneously, as if the gesture had been rehearsed. My voice died mid-sentence about the alarming quality failures I'd uncovered, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the ventilation system overhead. "We're done listening to her failures," announced Baxter, the COO, his voice carrying that particular timbre of someone who believed himself permanently untouchable. "This presentation is a waste of valuable time." The rustle of expensive suits filled the boardroom as they gathered their tablets and notebooks. No one looked at me. No one spoke directly to me. The methodical way they ignored my presence felt calculated, deliberate, engineered to maximize humiliation in front of the junior staff watching through the glass partition. "The numbers speak for themselves," I said, struggling to maintain composure. "Our customers are perfectly satisfied," interrupted Vivian, the VP of Operations, her smile never wavering as she added, "Perhaps you should consider whether you're truly suited for this level of responsibility." They moved toward the exit in a tight cluster, and the sound of their leather shoes against the polished floor seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. 12 executives, the entire leadership team, walking out while I stood there, hands still raised toward data that showed indisputable evidence of their negligence. Monroe, the CFO, was the last to leave. He paused at the doorway, his hand hovering near the light switch. "Don't bother finishing. No one will read your report." He flicked the lights off, leaving me in semi-darkness, illuminated only by my own damning presentation. 30 seconds passed in that dimmed room. My heartbeat slowed from racing panic to something steadier, colder. The betrayal crystallized into something harder, something actionable because I had anticipated this reaction. I had practically counted on it. The public rejection was merely confirmation of everything I'd suspected for months, and it had delivered something invaluable, their unified contempt, captured in perfect, archival quality detail. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a number I'd saved weeks ago, but hoped I wouldn't need to use quite so soon, and pressed call. When she answered, I spoke 7 words that would change everything. "They did exactly what you said they would." "All of them?" asked the voice on the other end. "Every single one, and it's all recorded." A pause. "Give me 4 hours." I ended the call and sat back in my chair, staring at the data still projected on the screen. The quality failures, the cover-ups, the altered test results, everything they hadn't wanted anyone to see. My name is Leona. Until 3 months ago, I was the quality assurance director at one of the country's leading industrial equipment manufacturers. Our products were installed in hospitals, schools, and government facilities nationwide, the kind of equipment people trusted with their safety without a second thought. I wasn't always someone who made powerful enemies. Growing up in a small industrial town, I learned early that systems had flaws, but honesty mattered more than convenience. My father worked 30 years at the local factory, coming home with stories about corners cut and warnings ignored. When the plant closed after a preventable accident that took 2 lives, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would never stay silent if lives were at risk. That promise had guided every career decision I'd made in the 17 years since. My reputation in the industry was built on thoroughness. I fixed broken systems without publicly damaging the companies I worked for. I was known as someone who found solutions rather than someone who manufactured crises, and that reputation was precisely why they had recruited me. "We need someone with your integrity," Baxter had said during my final interview, his smile warm and disarmingly convincing. "Minor inefficiencies have crept into our processes. Fresh eyes, that's all we need." My predecessor, Tomas, had left suddenly. Health issues, they claimed, though his team seemed oddly reluctant to discuss him in any detail. When I asked about his documentation, I received vague responses about a unique filing system that hadn't been properly transferred before his departure, and every person who mentioned it looked slightly away when they said it. The first warning sign came during my initial facility tour. Nadia, a quality technician with 8 years at the company, showed me around with mechanical precision. Her answers felt rehearsed and carefully measured until we reached the testing laboratory. When I asked about their validation protocols, her eyes darted toward a small camera mounted in the corner before answering. "We follow established company procedures," she said, her voice tight in a way that had nothing to do with professionalism. Later that week, I found testing results that didn't match the manufacturing outputs. Equipment that had failed critical safety checks was being shipped with approval signatures nonetheless. Clean paperwork attached to compromised products heading toward hospitals and care facilities. When I brought this to my team, they stared at their hands, silent and afraid in a way that told me this was not the first time someone had raised the question. "Just follow established protocols," Baxter instructed when I requested a private meeting to discuss what I'd found. Previous leadership complicated things unnecessarily. The following day, a bonus notification appeared in my company account, substantially more than my contracted amount, with no explanation provided. I declined it, flagged it to HR as a potential administrative error, and continued investigating. The patterns became unmistakably clear within 6 weeks. Our flagship medical equipment line had critical safety flaws that were being deliberately concealed through layered bureaucratic obfuscation. Testing protocols had been quietly modified to hide defects. Customer complaints were being intercepted, rerouted, and buried before they could reach anyone with actual authority. "The issue isn't with the product," Vivian explained when I presented my initial findings to her privately. "It's with user expectations. Every industry has acceptable margins of error." "Not when those errors could harm people," I countered. She slid a folder across her desk. Inside was a revised employment contract featuring a substantial salary increase and an unusual confidentiality clause written in language that would have effectively transferred my professional conscience to the company's legal team. "Everyone benefits from regulatory flexibility," she said, tapping the signature line. "We reward team players generously." I took the contract, told her I'd consider it, and continued gathering evidence that same evening. That night I received an anonymous email containing previous safety reports, the originals, ones that had been quietly altered in our official records. The sender's message was 3 words: "Tomas wasn't sick." The morning of my presentation to the executive team, I found Nadia waiting beside my car in the parking structure, constantly checking over her shoulder. "They're setting you up," she whispered. "They've told everyone your report is attention-seeking exaggeration. Baxter already has your termination paperwork prepared." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because Tomas tried to do the right thing too." Her voice cracked slightly. "He didn't deserve what happened to him." She walked away before I could ask more, but something in her eyes, the same haunted expression I'd seen in my entire team for 3 months, solidified my decision completely. I made one crucial modification to my presentation before the meeting. I removed the single slide containing the most damning evidence, saving it for a different purpose entirely. After the executives abandoned the meeting room, I sat alone in the semi-darkness and made the call, not to a journalist, not to a lawyer, but to Eliza, the lead investigator at the regulatory agency overseeing our industry, someone who had been quietly building a parallel case for months before I'd even been hired. "I sent you everything from today," I told her. "The walkout was almost exactly as we predicted, and they made those comments about the Cincinnati incident on record." Her voice was measured and professional. Monroe specifically mentioned handling it like Cincinnati when discussing the suppressed incident reports. "Yes, word for word." Perfect, that connects the dots we needed. Keys clicked softly in the background. Stay where you are for now. Act normal if anyone returns. I gathered my materials slowly and methodically, because the humiliation that should have crushed me had instead hardened into absolute certainty. For 3 months, I had been building a case while they thought they were breaking me down, and the distinction between those two activities was about to become catastrophically apparent to everyone involved. The first time I had contacted Eliza wasn't planned at all. I'd found her name buried in correspondence my predecessor had hidden in encrypted files, and what I found there changed the entire shape of my understanding. Tomas hadn't left for health reasons. He had been systematically documenting the same issues I'd discovered, assembling the same evidence with the same meticulous care. His final report had vanished the same day as his sudden departure, and when I reached out to Eliza through a secure channel, she was initially cautious. Tomas stopped responding to my inquiries 3 months ago, she explained during our first conversation. The company claimed he was unavailable due to medical leave. He's not sick, I said. At least not according to his wife, who I located through mutual industry contacts. She says he accepted a massive settlement with an attached gag order after being threatened with manufactured fraud charges. Our collaboration began that night. We both understood that a direct confrontation wouldn't work. The executives had covered their tracks too carefully, with entire legal departments ready to bury any accusation under procedural challenges and strategic delays. We needed them to incriminate themselves, and we needed it on record. So I had let them believe I was simply another well-intentioned employee they could manage, deflect, and eventually neutralize. I had accepted the vague warnings and the attempted bonuses with apparent naivety. I had allowed Vivian's barely concealed threats to wash over me without visible reaction, and I had walked into that presentation knowing exactly how it would end and exactly what it would produce. What they interpreted as my defeat was, in fact, the closing argument. After leaving the meeting room, I walked through the empty halls toward my office. The silence felt weighted now, expectant rather than empty. I checked my watch. 2 hours until Eliza's team would make their move. My office door was slightly ajar. Inside, sitting in my chair, was Vivian. That was quite a spectacle, she said, turning my computer monitor toward herself with practiced casualness, though not surprising given your approach. I set my materials down carefully. Was there something else you wanted to say that you couldn't share with the group? She smiled that particular smile that never showed teeth. You know, Leona, I actually argued for hearing you. Your reputation for fixing problems genuinely impressed me, but you misunderstood your assignment from the beginning. She stood, smoothing her skirt. Your assignment was to fix the perception problem, not to create a new one. She moved toward the door. Your position has been terminated, effective immediately. Security will collect you in 20 minutes. Whatever materials you've gathered stay here, including your personal notes. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Everything. The company owns all work product created during your employment. I understand, I nodded. Something in my calm acceptance made her visibly suspicious. This isn't a negotiation, Leona. You've made enemies of people who don't forget, people with influence across the entire industry. Is that a threat? It's reality. Your career ended the moment you decided to go against this team. She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the frame. Though I do respect your principles, misguided as they are, principles aren't much compared to 12 executives' unanimous opinion. After she left, I opened my desk drawer. Inside sat a small device that had been recording every conversation in my office for 10 weeks. I slipped it into my pocket just as my phone buzzed with a text from Eliza. Second phase proceeding now. 4 agents arriving. Meet in lobby in 10. I gathered my personal items, just enough to appear compliant without raising suspicion, and walked through the department one final time. My team watched with expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed fear. Some knew what was coming. Others believed they were witnessing my final departure and disgrace, and I allowed them to believe it because that belief would make what followed infinitely more impactful. Nadia caught up with me near the elevator. "They're saying you tried to blame production for design flaws," she whispered urgently. "Baxter's already announcing your replacement." "Are they now?" I pressed the down button. "Interesting timing." "What will you do?" Her voice trembled. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. "Sometimes," I said, stepping inside, "you have to let people believe they've won before they realize they've lost." The lobby was buzzing with afternoon activity when the glass doors swung open and four individuals in dark suits entered, led by Eliza herself. Her badge was already prominently visible as she approached the security desk. "Regulatory Enforcement Division," she announced, her voice carrying cleanly across the marble. "We have a warrant to access specific company records and to conduct interviews with named individuals." The security guard looked panicked, reaching immediately for his phone, and within minutes the lobby had transformed into carefully controlled chaos. Employees stopped mid-stride to watch. Phones emerged. Someone from legal rushed down demanding to see paperwork, and Eliza handed over documents with the unhurried confidence of someone who had prepared for every possible objection. Baxter appeared eventually, red-faced, hissing instructions to a junior attorney who looked increasingly alarmed with each exchange. When he spotted me near the reception desk, his expression transformed from anger into calculating suspicion, and he strode over to position himself between me and the proceedings. "I hope you understand what you've done," he said quietly. "This will destroy more than just your career." "That sounds concerning," I replied. "Perhaps you should share those thoughts with the agents upstairs." His face tightened. "You signed confidentiality agreements." "Anything I shared was provided through proper regulatory channels," I finished for him. "Nothing outside standard mandatory reporting requirements." The color drained from his face as he processed the implication fully. I hadn't leaked anything to the press or to competitors. I had simply followed the mandatory reporting protocols they had been circumventing for years, and there was no legal mechanism on Earth that could be used against someone for doing that. "You have no idea what forces you're playing with," he said. "This company has survived worse than one disgruntled employee." I maintained eye contact and smiled. "I'm not disgruntled, Baxter. I'm doing exactly what you hired me to do, ensuring quality standards are met. The fact that you tried to prevent me from doing my job doesn't mean I stopped doing it." Something in my expression unsettled him because he stepped back slightly. "Security will escort you out." "Actually," said a voice behind him, "Miss Leona will be staying to assist our investigation." Eliza stood there, her badge prominently displayed. "We have several questions about the presentation that was interrupted earlier today." The next 4 hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed sequence. Agents moved through the building, securing servers and documentation with systematic efficiency. Executives were isolated in separate conference rooms for individual interviews. Employees watched wide-eyed as years of careful deception began unraveling in real time, connection by connection, document by document. I sat in a conference room, not the original one, answering questions and providing context as Eliza's team assembled their case. Through the glass walls, I could see the growing realization spreading visibly across the open office floor as whiteboards filled with timelines and connections none of them had thought would ever become visible. At 4:30, Monroe was escorted from his office, ashen-faced and silent. By 5:15, 8 more executives followed, not in handcuffs yet, but clearly no longer in control of anything, including their own departures from the building. As they passed the conference room where I sat, Baxter locked eyes with me through the glass, the recognition flickering across his face. The full understanding that the woman they'd publicly dismissed as incompetent had spent 3 months systematically dismantling their entire operation from within was almost worth every week of anxiety and deliberate, grinding patience. But this was only the beginning. What none of them knew yet was that the following morning, their carefully constructed infrastructure would collapse in ways none of them could possibly have anticipated. The evidence secured that day was one piece of a much larger architecture, one that had been forming quietly for years before I arrived. The true scale of what was coming wouldn't be apparent until the emergency board meeting scheduled for 8 the next morning, and by then, it would be far too late for damage control, far too late for lawyers, too late for anything except watching it end. The next morning arrived with the surreal brightness that follows life-altering events. I dressed methodically, charcoal gray suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back. Today wasn't about making an impression. It was about witnessing accountability rendered in real time. The company headquarters looked different in the early morning light, somehow vulnerable. Security had been increased, with unfamiliar personnel checking identification at every entrance. News vehicles waited at the property perimeter, held back by temporary barriers. "Miss Leona," said a woman I didn't recognize at the executive entrance. "I'm Zoe, assistant to the board chair. You're expected upstairs." The executive floor was eerily quiet. Glass offices that usually hummed with activity stood empty, their occupants absent. Computer screens displayed login pages that would never again welcome their usual users, and the particular stillness of spaces emptied by consequence rather than by choice was everywhere. Zoe led me to a side room adjacent to the main boardroom. Through a partially open door, I could see people gathering, somber faces, urgent whispers, water glasses no one touched. "Wait here," Zoe instructed. "The chair will call you when they're ready." Alone, I checked my phone. A message from Eliza, second phase proceeding. 9 search warrants being executed simultaneously. From the boardroom, voices grew louder, someone demanding answers, another insisting on legal representation, a third cutting through the noise with firm authority. "This meeting will come to order," announced Edmund, the board chair. "We face unprecedented allegations that require immediate action." The door opened. Edmund, a silver-haired man with calculating eyes and the measured bearing of someone accustomed to institutional crises, nodded at me. "Please join us." The boardroom held 23 people, the full 12-person board, several senior executives who hadn't attended my presentation the previous day, and a cluster of grave-faced attorneys. 3 chairs at the executive table sat conspicuously empty. "For those who haven't met her," Edmund said, "this is Leona, our quality assurance director, or rather, our former director, according to termination papers filed yesterday afternoon without my approval." He paused deliberately. "She has agreed to present her findings directly to this board before speaking with federal investigators later today." Baxter, rigid near the far end of the table, interrupted. "This is highly irregular. Our attorneys should review any materials before." "You've forfeited that privilege," Edmund cut in. "The regulators have already seized most company records. We're trying to understand what's happening before the markets open, and this company loses half its value." He turned to me. "The floor is yours." I connected my tablet to the presentation system. The room darkened, and the screens illuminated with the same slides I'd begun showing the previous day before the walkout. As I started explaining yesterday before the executive team departed, I began, my voice steady. "Our quality assurance protocols have been systematically compromised for approximately 36 months. For 40 minutes, I laid out everything I'd discovered methodically. Without editorializing, altered test results, suppressed incident reports, modified safety parameters. I showed communications proving deliberate concealment of equipment failures, including 3 that had resulted in documented patient injuries at hospital facilities. Board members' expressions shifted visibly from skepticism to shock to barely contained fury. "This cannot be accurate," insisted Vivian when I paused. "These are isolated incidents being presented without appropriate context." "Actually," I replied, "I haven't shown you the most significant evidence yet." I switched to a new set of slides that no one in the room had seen before. These contained financial records showing patterns of payments to offshore accounts following regulatory inspections, tracing diagrams linking executive bonuses directly to falsified quality metrics, and email chains discussing containment strategies for potential whistleblowers, written in the casual shorthand of people who never imagined being read by outsiders. "Where did you get these?" Monroe demanded, his voice rough. "From Tomas," I replied calmly. "Before he was forced out, he created secured backups of everything. He anticipated being silenced, however he didn't anticipate how thoroughly you would do it." I turned to address the full board. Tomas didn't leave because of health issues. He left because he was given a choice: sign a settlement with a gag order or face manufactured fraud charges. His final act was encrypting these files with a dead man protocol, instructing them to be transmitted to specific recipients if he failed to reset a digital timer every 30 days. "That constitutes theft of company property," one attorney interjected. Edmund raised his hand for silence. "Continue." "When I was hired, I received an anonymous message with access credentials for these files. Initially, I suspected it might be a trap, but as my own investigation confirmed the same patterns Tomas had documented independently, the truth became undeniable." I clicked to the next slide. Video footage from my presentation the previous day filled the screen, capturing the moment the executive team walked out simultaneously, including their remarks, including Monroe's specific reference to the Cincinnati incident. The crystal-clear audio brought a profound silence to the room. "You recorded that illegally," Baxter snapped. "Actually," I countered, "all meeting rooms in this building have automatic recording capabilities for archival and compliance purposes, as outlined in the Company Policy Manual, Section 4.3. I requested access to those archives this morning, which Edmund approved through proper administrative channels." Edmund's expression revealed nothing, but the slight nod he directed toward me carried its own unmistakable weight. "This morning," I continued, "federal agents are executing search warrants at 9 executives' private residences, specifically targeting communications relating to the Cincinnati incident from last year. The one where equipment failure in an operating room was attributed to user error despite internal documentation proving otherwise." "How do you know about Cincinnati?" Monroe whispered. I tilted my head slightly. "Because I was hired to discover exactly these types of issues. The fact that you tried to prevent me from doing my job doesn't mean I stopped doing it." The following hour devolved into crisis management. External counsel was summoned, press statements drafted and redrafted, market analysts contacted with carefully worded talking points that became more desperate with each revision. Through it all, I sat quietly, watching their world collapse in slow motion with the particular patience of someone who had nothing left to lose and had therefore become genuinely dangerous. By noon, trading of company stock had been suspended. By 2, 9 resignation letters had been submitted. By 4, federal prosecutors announced preliminary charges against 7 executives, with additional charges expected as the investigation widened. As the day wound down, Edmund asked me to stay behind. "You've been planning this for months," he said once the room had emptied. "It wasn't a question." "From the 3rd week of my employment," I confirmed. "Once I understood what was happening, I had 2 choices: become complicit or bring it down entirely. You could have come to me directly." I studied him carefully. "Could I have, Edmund? 3 board members' signatures appear on approval documents for the modified testing protocols. Ignorance by choice is still a choice. He accepted the rebuke with a slow nod. What happens now? That depends on what this board decides. The company can survive this, but not with the same leadership structure and not with the same priorities embedded in every process. And where do you fit in that future? I smiled. I don't. My resignation will be on your desk tomorrow. My work here is finished. The next morning, I watched from my apartment as news channels displayed footage of executives being escorted from their homes in the early light. Men and women who had stood in that boardroom 2 days ago believing their synchronized contempt made them invincible. The company's stock had dropped 42% at opening. Class action lawsuits were being assembled by 3 separate legal teams. Industry analysts were predicting complete structural overhaul and potential acquisition. What none of them understood yet, what no one outside of Tomas, Eliza, and myself had ever understood, was that this had never been about what happened to me in that darkened conference room. The humiliation had been irrelevant. The termination had been expected. The career threats had been anticipated weeks before they were delivered. This had been about the patients harmed by equipment that should never have been approved. It had been about the employees threatened into silence over years of accumulated fear. It had been about Tomas, who had done everything right and lost everything anyway, until his dead man protocol finally found the right recipient. My phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Is this Leona? It is. This is Dr. Harrington at Memorial Hospital. Our medical safety board has been following developments closely and would like to discuss a consulting position, specifically helping hospital systems identify compromised equipment currently in use. Would you be interested? Very much so, I said. I ended the call and looked back at the screen, where a reporter was standing outside the company headquarters describing what she called a catastrophic institutional failure. She was not wrong, but she was describing only the surface of it, the visible collapse, the named charges, the stock numbers falling in real time. She couldn't see what I could see from where I stood, that the architecture of what I'd built over 3 months had not ended when the agents arrived, had not concluded when the resignations came in, had not finished when the charges were announced. It was still running. The files Tomas had encrypted were still transmitting to the additional recipients on his list: regulatory contacts, institutional investors, and 3 hospital safety boards in different states who would each receive, in the coming 72 hours, documentation specific to the equipment installed in their facilities. The 12 executives had walked out of that room believing they held every form of power that mattered: professional, institutional, financial, social. They had believed it so completely that they had performed it: the synchronized departure, the lights switched off, the final dismissal delivered from a doorway. What they had actually performed without knowing it was a confession. And I had been the only person in the room who understood what they were signing.